Hello. I'd forgotten what it's like to be stood up here in front of so many people. It's been a while. My name is Jon Dixon. I'm a senior interaction designer at a company called Bunnyfoot. And Bunnyfoot are a user-centered design company. And so what I'll do every day, very different from the other speakers, is pretty much what I suspect most of you do every day, those of you that are involved in user experience design. At any particular day, I can be found moderating formative user testing sessions, or putting together personas, or building wireframes, or creating information architectures, perhaps doing visual designs, maybe doing a bit of ethnography. Really wide remit for the company. And as I say, I have a very different background from the rest of the speakers, except for possibly Danny Hope, who has a sort of similar background to me. I've only been involved with user experience for about 15 years, although I say only, actually 15 years, that's about as long as user experience has been in existence as a sort of recognized, discrete discipline, I suppose. But before that, 15 years ago, I was a professional actor. And those are various me's over the years there, in a variety of guises. So how did I get to be what I am now? I was a reasonably successful actor. I managed to scrape a living without starving to death for 20 years or so, which counts as a success in the acting career, believe me. But like all actors, I had to have a second string to my bow because you can't rely on the work coming in. Mine was illustrating. I'd always had a knack for drawing, and I parlayed that into an illustrating career that ran alongside my acting career. And then about 15 years ago, I decided that I wanted a change of career, and I went and I worked as a graphic designer for a small new media company in Derby, where I live. And very quickly, due to a series of acquisitions from other companies, I found myself catapulted into the world of, first of all, usability, and then user experience and customer experience and user-centered design. And I had a hell of a steep learning curve, and suddenly I had to learn how to be a user experience designer, like many of you. I learned how to be an actor, though, at the Bristol Vic Theatre School. And I was at the Bristol Vic Theatre School for about 3 years, 75 to 78. And like many students, I lived in shared accommodation with a whole bunch of other students at the time. And here's a bunch of us in one of our shared accommodations in Redland Road in Bristol. On your left, there is my best friend, Tim Bentinck, who now plays David Archer in The Archers. The lady sitting on Kim's knee at the front is Jenny Seagrove, who's become a doyenne of the West End. And you can probably see, lurking at the back, a rather quiet and gentle and rather intense young man called Dan. And there's another picture of Dan with my friend Judy. Here's Dan again, doing the washing up. Anybody recognized him? Okay, so let's fast forward nearly 40 years. And there's Dan picking up the third Best Actor Academy Award, the first person in history to actually do that. So you can see that our careers have diverged enormously since 1978. Dan is now one of the best known and best movie actors in the world, and I'm standing on a stage here in Brighton talking to you today. But the really... Thank you very much. Thank you. But the really interesting thing, and really what the subject of my talk today is about, is that even though our careers have diverged so incredibly widely, I think that Dan and I are still doing pretty much the same thing as each other. Why do I say that? Well, because I think actors create user experiences. Now, they create it in a bit of an odd way because they're at the same time the creator and the user, the experiencer, and then they allow us to share that experience by performing, we watch the film, we watch the stage play or whatever, and we vicariously share the experience through them. Whereas user experience designers are solely creators. They design directly for an audience. But that doesn't mean that the truth of the characters that are being created, whether they're characters that have been created to be performed, or whether they're characters that we create as personas when we're designing experiences as representative members of our eventual audience, it doesn't matter that the truth and the integrity of those have to be the same from one to the other. And truth is pretty much the most important thing that an actor can have in their performance, although there's a famous quote that I've heard ascribed to various people, from Groucho Marx right the way through to Laurence Olivier, which says that the great secret of success for an actor is absolute honesty. And once you've learned how to fake that, you've got it made. But the fact is, joking apart, that truth is really important. You can tell when an actor's not being truthful. The great brilliance of Dan is that regardless of what he's playing, regardless of the character that he's playing, you absolutely believe it. It's absolutely truthful. And without that truth, the experience that we create, both as actors and as user experience designers, is incomplete. And to get to the truth, what we have to do is we have to inhabit our users. We have to become them. We have to experience their reality. So how do great actors like Dan do that? Dan is probably the best known exponent of a school of acting called the method. And it's a much misunderstood technique that's used. Very often it's mocked a little bit. You know, you read articles in the newspaper about Dan sort of, you know, going off and living in a particular way for months and months and months on end. It's not really about that. But Dan is a great method actor. And many actors, regardless of the full technique that they use, will have method at the heart of it. And I want to talk today about 4 people who were the primary exponents of method acting over the years, and I want to very quickly give you a high-level insight into what each one of them brought to the method, and more, what I think we can learn as user experience people from those. As I say, I think Dan and I are still doing much the same thing. So those are the 4 people there. Stanislavski was the first person to come up with the method, although he didn't call it the method, he called it the system. Stanislavski was an actor and a director and a theatre teacher, a practitioner, a theoretician, working at the end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century. And acting at that time, if we could get in a time machine and we could actually go back to Russia at the time of Stanislavski and we could watch one of the performances that he would have watched, we would have seen a very different style of acting from anything we're used to today. We would have seen people taking poses like this. We would have seen people emoting through the use of gesture. We've all seen that kind of actor. He ran right the way into sort of early silent films. You see people actually symbolizing an emotion rather than depicting an emotion. So there was you went and you learned the gestures for fear, anger, you know, all of those things. And if we could watch those acting performances today, we would think that they were theatrical, bombastic, declaratory, nothing to do with real life. And those are the performances that Stanislavski would have seen. But he noticed that in among all of those grand theatrical performances, there were other actors who were very different. And they were much more believable. There was a reality in their performance. They were low-key. Something about what they were doing made them recognizable as real human beings rather than acted, depicted characters. And he became fascinated by this and devoted the whole of his life to developing a theory of it, which he called the system, and a way of teaching it so that he could spread it wider, because he loved that style of acting. He was very influenced by all sorts of things that were going on at the time. This was a time of huge change all across Europe. There was modernism was coming in, naturalism, the avant-garde, all of those things. But one of his main influences in the development of the system came from a really strange, odd place. And it's a place that's already been mentioned once today. Susan mentioned it. One of his big influences was our old friend, Ivan Pavlov, the physiologist, the biologist with the dogs. And the reason for that was that Pavlov's area of study, as Susan said earlier, was conditioning. You know, the bell, dog, saliva, you know, all of that. And observed behaviours. So, and Stanislavski was absolutely fascinated by this concept that behaviours are learned, not natural, and that they are learned through conditioning. Add into the mix something else that was happening at the same time, also in the psychology sort of area, was the beginnings of something that became known as psychophysiology, which is the idea, and several speakers have already alluded to this today, particularly Natalie, that psychological states create physiological effects. And Stanislavski wondered, sort of a bit ahead of his time really, because this wasn't studied fully until later, I think I'm right in saying. Stanislavski wondered if the opposite was not true, whether you could not create within yourself a psychological state by mimicking the physiological state that goes with it. So if you weep when you are sad, can you actually make yourself sad by mimicking weeping? And the answer actually turns out to be yes, to an extent. And so those two, both things came together into his theory of acting, which was using affective memory and emotional recall, things like that, to mimic the physical states that go along with psychological states in order to get truth into the performance. And he was hugely influential. He was really the father of naturalistic acting, Stanislavski. And as he said, the actor creates the character not just from the outside in, but also from the inside out. So why is Stanislavski important to us as UX practitioners? Well, I think because in a way, he sums up for actors everything we're talking about today. An actor's job is to portray humanity, to portray people. And a UX designer's job is to design for people. And you have to understand people in order to design for them. And in order to understand people, you have to understand all the psychological drivers, the fears, the anxieties, the desires, the needs, all of those unconscious things that Susan and others have talked about today, all the things that are going on in that reptilian hindbrain, all of the things that are going on in the amygdala and all of those other things. And so Stanislavski, in making psychology the underpinning of acting, really laid the groundwork in theatre and later film, and that's a lesson for us to learn, I think, as designers, that when we're designing user experiences, we have to understand the psychology underneath it. Okay, fast forward 30 years, and a guy called Lee Strasberg comes onto the scene. Lee Strasberg was an American actor and theatre practitioner. He eventually became leader of the Actors Studio in the 1950s, and the Actors Studio was responsible for some of the greatest movie actors of the 20th century. Marlon Brando, Rod Steiger, Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy, Marilyn Monroe, far better actress than she's very often given credit for. All of those people went through the Actors Studio, and latterly people like Al Pacino and Robert De Niro and so on. So hugely influential man, Strasberg. And Strasberg it was that took Stanislavski's system and turned it into the method, which is what gives us method acting today. And what he did was he actually took Stanislavski even further. I'm going to talk about two little things that Strasberg brought to method acting. The first of which was that he went for a much more purely psychological attitude to acting. He said that the actor is asked to react on stage to a set of imaginary stimuli. And I don't know whether anybody's ever done any amateur acting or even professional acting like me. You can do things in real life perfectly naturally, perfectly ordinary, without even thinking about them. As soon as you are asked to actually do exactly the same thing on stage in a fictional scenario, you really start to struggle to get that level of naturalism. The hardest thing for an actor to do is actually be completely natural. It's really difficult to do. And the reason for that, Strasberg postulated, was that we as human beings are not programmed, we are not capable of play acting, mimicking real life. And so in order to get a truthful performance on stage, an actor has to genuinely believe somehow that they're in the situation that they're in. The actor has to convince themselves of the rightness of what they're doing in order to produce a truthful effect. And the way that Strasberg developed of doing that was through something called emotional recall, which is a development of affective memory, the idea that you can recall emotions and replay them in the present. It's sometimes called sense memory among actors. I don't know whether that's true in psychology as well. And so what he got his actors to do was to plunder their backstories, was to go into their pasts and find emotions and occasions where they'd been moved negatively or positively in the past, bring them forward into the present in order to illuminate the role. And this did actually give enormous, great psychological depth. It also caused a bit of a falling out among his fellow actors. And I don't think it's a huge use to us as user experience practitioners. So I put it in there as a warning, really, because the trouble is with that emotional recall is we're getting away from something that's been touched on by other speakers here today, observed behaviors, that was such a core of Stanislavski's original system. As soon as you start bringing your own emotions into what you're designing, you're kind of starting to design for you rather than for your audience. And that's dangerous. It's not necessarily wrong because, as Natalie said, empathy is a huge, huge part of what we do. So the other thing that he quickly brought into it was backstory. Strasberg said that an actor not only had to delve into the character's life on stage, but also had to delve into the character's life before the curtain rises. He was the first person, really, certainly in the theatrical sense, to understand that a user, a character, comes to the moment of design, whether it's on stage or what we design, with backstory, with baggage, with assumptions, with mental models of things that have gone before. That the user experience, when we're designing it, extends beyond, in both directions, the thing that we're actually designing. Stella Adler, wonderful, wonderful American actress. She was one of the people that disagreed with Strasberg about this emotional recall. She found it rather distasteful. She thought that if taken to extremes, if given to undue prominence, that it led to self-indulgence and it was wrong. What she wanted was a balanced and pragmatic mixture of imagination and memory, underpinned, and this is where she's important for us, underpinned by intensive research. That's what she brought to the party. She said that an actor could not portray a character with different values or from a different culture to their own without intensively researching and understanding the background and the situation of that character. She said famously, you cannot play a blacksmith, truthfully, unless you know how to shoe a horse. And I think that's important for us, that research is the starting point for any of our designs. You know, depth immersion, depth interviews, going on site, talking to people, diary studies, all of those things is where you gather the data that Blay talked about, this importance of this repository of data on which to design. That's where that comes from. And that's where Stella Adler is important. Research is all. Finally, I just want to talk very quickly about Sandy Meisner. He was a co-contemporary of Strasberg and Stella Adler. What he brought to the party that was slightly different was spontaneity. People who rehearsed with Sandy Meisner sometimes didn't get a script for months. They might not even know the play that they were doing. What he wanted to do, he wanted to free actors to be able to react in the moment. That was the phrase that became associated with Sandy Meisner, in the moment. And the way that he did that was he would have improvisational exercises which got people away from the script, got people away from line learning, line readings. You were inhabiting the moment. Your responses were instinctive and instant and natural. They were real responses to real situations. I think that tells us that we need to be open to change when we're doing creative design ideation workshops, for example, when we're conceptualizing the things that we're going to eventually design. Or conversely, when we're testing those designs and we're doing user testing, if you're ever moderating a user testing session, you have to be prepared to depart from the script. You have to be prepared to react to something that somebody might say that you haven't actually foreseen, the black swan. You have to be prepared. I've had occasion, you know, when I've been testing and somebody said something that's not in the script and I thought, that's really interesting, I need to follow that up. And you have to go off and explore that, and very often the deepest insight comes from the things that you hadn't predicted when you put together the script for that testing. So the other thing that I wanted to quickly say about Sandy Meisner, the reason I wanted him in there, he also came up with one of the best definitions of acting I've ever come across, except for Ralph Richardson. Ralph Richardson once defined acting as the art of stopping a large number of people from coughing, which is a great definition. But Meisner's definition was great. He said that acting is living truthfully under imaginary circumstances. Isn't that great? Living truthfully under imaginary circumstances. It's the best definition of acting I've ever come across. I think it's a great definition of good user experience as well, or certainly how we should do it. Think of it as a mission statement for you as user experience designers. We need to create characters who live truthfully under the imaginary circumstances that we are designing for them. And that will make great design. Because effectively, the truth is that those people up there are exactly the same as those people, who, as you can tell by their pastel sweaters and their perfect smiles, are personas. That's Mr. and Mrs. Stock Photo and their 2.4 lovely children. We've all seen them, and indeed I take Natalie's point about the fakeness of the smiles. Yeah, that's, you can see them there. But they are the same people. Those are the people that we're actually designing for, and everybody who works in user-centered design or UX has probably got something like that lurking around on their hard drive. That's the Bunnyfoot one. That's Bunnyfoot's user-centered design process. It's got roughly 5 stages. You research, you model based on the results of that research. You then take those models, those personas, those scenarios, those mental models, you architect them into wireframes and information architectures and possibly interactive prototypes. You test all that at the early stage to make sure you catch all the stuff before you go into the really expensive stuff like development and all of that. Then you color it all in, you give it visuals and you give it brand, and finally you monitor it to make sure that it's all still going okay, and you know, you go round and round and round with people testing, real users at the heart of it all, and it's the real users really that I'm talking about today. So actors go through those 5 stages. They do their research, they do their training, they do their on-site immersion, they go and find out about different cultures. Then they start putting the character together using psychophysiology and emotional recall and all those things. They go into slightly more technical things like text analysis and line readings. They have read-throughs and workshops, which is those early testing to make sure everything's okay. Then they go into the really technical stuff. There's voice training and movement, and you color it in. The equivalent of the visual design would be costume and makeup and all that stuff, what you're going to look like. And then finally, when they're actually up there and they're giving the performance, they're monitoring it. You know, there's a great analogy for an actor, which is that it's a bit like being on a racehorse, riding in a race, where you're both the racehorse and the rider. And the racehorse doesn't know anything about any of that technical stuff. The racehorse is just in the moment, to quote Sandy Meisner. The racehorse, all that cares about is running as fast as it can and getting to the end. It doesn't know that it's in a race. But the jockey, on the back of it, he's reading the course. He's deciding what line to go into the corner. He's watching why everybody else is around him. And that's what acting is. Actors are constantly monitoring themselves, even though they're lost in the moment and giving a truthful performance. So if we take exactly the same thing and suddenly magically transform me into me as an interaction designer, we do exactly the same thing. There's our research. There's our creation of the characters, the personas, the mental models, and the experience maps, all the way down through the whole thing until we've gone live with the full visually rich thing, and we're monitoring it. We're doing surveys and analytics, and we go round and round and round and round and round. It's exactly the same. So what I want to leave you with is those sort of 5 things that are on the screen then, that are drawn kind of from method acting, but are equally applicable to us as user experience designers. I think we need to understand our users in order to create experiences for them that are meaningful and that meet their needs, often not the needs that they've been able to express to us, because they're needs that they themselves might not know that they have. And therefore, how could they express them to us? We need to understand them to that depth that we can understand them enough to create experiences to match needs they don't know they have. And the only way we can do that is to actually inhabit our users, to become them, to experience their reality empathetically, psychologically, internally, externally, so that we can indeed design not just from the outside in, but also from the inside out. I want to leave you with one last thing from a purely personal thing, my journey, if you like, to being the UX designer that I am today from an actor. There may be people in the audience here who are just starting out in UX, I don't know. People who may be in the same position that I was 15 years ago, when I was looking at all of this other stuff that I suddenly had to learn, the psychological underpinning of it all. I started reading people like B.J. Fogg and Don Norman and, you know, Susan and all of those people, and it seemed like an awful lot for me to suddenly take in. And I was in that position where I was going, I have to get all this stuff. I have to get this psychology and persuasion design and designing for the emotions and all of that. I have to get all of that into my design that's due next Thursday. And if I don't, I failed. And I got really stressed about it. And then I suddenly had a sort of a bit of an epiphany. And I went, well, actually, you know, a lot of this stuff is familiar. A lot of it is stuff that I've done before. And I would suggest to you that it is familiar, because all of the stuff that's being talked about today isn't just describing our users as some external thing. It's actually describing us and you. Everybody in this room today. This that we're talking about today, the psychology that underpins design, is not describing someone other than us, it's describing us. Because all of us, actors, user experience designers, psychologists, all of us, what we're doing is we're exploring and creating a shared human condition. So don't worry. It will all come right. You will know all of this eventually. And even if you don't, somebody else will put you right. One of the great expert speakers that we've had today. So please don't worry, because if this guy can do it, anyone can. Thank you very much.